it's hard to really believe this story or this narrative that the Qataris put out, that they're these honest brokers, they're a neutral party that's seeking to bring people together, when it's very obvious if you look at their statements that they're not honest brokers, they're not neutral, and they're siding with one group, the violent group, over the other.
Natalie Ecanow is the brilliant and young, already senior research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is a Washington-based nonpartisan research institute focusing on foreign policy and national security. She joins us to explain how Qatar is using their vast wealth to influence American policy and whitewash their ties to terrorist groups like Hamas, the Taliban, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Natalie, welcome to my show. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Natalie, I want to start first by asking you, why are you interested in these topics? Give us a little bit about your background. What brought you to the Foundation for Defending Democracies?
I grew up in Chicago, in the suburbs of Chicago, in a family that was very interested in foreign policy, in politics, in world affairs. And I sort of grew up at the dinner table discussing these issues from a very young age. So when I went to college, I sort of didn't really know what I wanted to do. I went to Duke in North Carolina. I found myself gravitating towards political science classes, classes that had to do with philosophy, with history. And then through a series of career choices during college and post-grad, I found my way to FDD in Washington, D.C. I know Hebrew, so the Middle East seemed like a good fit in terms of area of focus, and then I was off to the races.
Excellent. You are incredibly impressive. I mean, only 26 years old and really on top of your game. Today, I just want to ask you about Qatar, because I know that a lot of your research focuses on that. For our listeners who don't know, what is the Muslim Brotherhood's connection to Qatar?
Right. So the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist organization. It is definitionally anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Israel, and Qatar really espouses these Muslim Brotherhood values, even if they don't formally accept the Muslim Brotherhood within their borders. Al Jazeera is a Qatari platform. Al Jazeera really is a tool that the Qatari government uses to spread this ideology around the world. Famously, Al Jazeera hosted a long-running talk show that was the star of the show was a spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. He died a couple years ago, but he famously endorsed suicide bombings against Israelis. So that sort of gives you a sense of the type of people and the type of ideology that the Qataris give a platform to. The Qataris have also thrown their money behind a lot of Muslim Brotherhood or Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organizations and governments in the region. Hamas, of course, being a very timely example. Hamas grew out of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Qatar, of course, has been a political and financial sponsor of Hamas really since the 1990s. That support escalated after Hamas took over Gaza in 2007. The former Qatari emir was actually the first world leader to visit Gaza after Hamas took over the Strip. And while he was there, he pledged $400 million to help fund infrastructure projects in Gaza. And since then, that number has really ballooned. I think since 2012, the latest I've seen is that the Qataris have pumped over $1 billion, that's billion with a B, $1 billion into the Gaza Strip. And that's not even mentioning letting Hamas leaders go on air on Al Jazeera, hosting them in Doha. There's actually a Hamas political office in Doha. So you really get a sense that they're championing the Muslim Brotherhood ideology and affiliated groups in more ways than one.
The cleric that you mentioned they hosted was Yusuf al-Qaradawi. And Yusuf al-Qaradawi, besides endorsing suicide bombings, was also famous for saying that, urging members of the Muslim Brotherhood to take over Europe and the West demographically and gradually, and without using violence, but through da'wah, or proselytizing combined with the process of Islamization. In that regard, to what degree does the Qatari government support the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yeah, I think a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology that sort of seeps through Qatari channels comes more in the form of soft power and propaganda, not so much, or I should say, not so much directly um, violence and that sort of thing. It's more of weaving these narratives into various social media platforms, news outlets, um, through their rhetoric at the UN and other international bodies. I think it's really interesting that the Qataris have, as far as I've seen, yet to explicitly condemn Hamas for the October 7th, 2023 attacks. And so it's more that sort of quiet long game that they're playing with this ideology, less so championing the more outwardly violent or forceful or more eye-popping elements of the ideology that would really raise eyebrows in the West.
Aside from the Muslim Brotherhood, what terrorist organizations or what other groups or even states who hold the same philosophical ideas as the Muslim Brotherhood does Qatar support?
Right. So there's the Muslim Brotherhood. There's, of course, Hamas. Qatar also has a close relationship with the Taliban. The Taliban also has an office in Doha. It opened around the same time as the Hamas office did. And the Qataris have been leading mediators between the US and the Taliban throughout the course, or they were mediators throughout the course of the war in Afghanistan. Um, and interestingly, the Qataris were very proud of the role that they played helping Afghan refugees immediately after the US withdrew from Afghanistan. Which is, if you think about it, a bit ironic because they were the ones that helped. The Qataris were the ones that helped negotiate that disastrous withdrawal. So the fact that they're now turning that narrative around and putting a positive light on their role is kind of ironic. Um, there's also connections between the Qataris and Al Qaeda, and also the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria, the Al Nusra Front, which, if you've been following the news or if your listeners have been following the news, the new Syrian leadership has its origins in that group. So Qatari influence really is peppered around the region. The Qataris have a close relationship with Iran. They share natural resources. And their partnership is sort of grown from there. Their military, the Iranian and Qatari military ties have been deepening recently. So the Qataris really do their have their hands in a lot of places where U.S. adversaries are operating.
I spoke to former Secretary of State Michael Pompeo the other day and I asked him about this question. It's very strange the way Qatar so openly funds not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but is affiliated, as you so eloquently describe, all of these ideologies, or rather organizations that share the same ideology as the Muslim Brotherhood, and that are at times apply propaganda tools and other nonviolent means of spreading radical Islam, and at other times actually do apply great violence, like Hamas, like Al Qaeda, like the Islamic State. And I said, how on earth is it possible that the United States still has a relationship with this country? And in terms of the Hamas story of hosting Hamas, etc., the former Secretary of State said the American administration knew all of this. And that may have to do with the way Qatar presents itself, not as a host of radical or terrorist organizations, but as sort of a mini United Nations where it is the key diplomatic state that brings all of these actors together so that they can work out their differences. What would you say to that?
I think my response to that would be twofold. One, to the extent that that argument was true, I think over a decade of testing it out has proven that it's not really working. I think particularly after the October 7th, 2023 attacks, it's become very apparent. that the Qataris' relationship with these bad actors isn't really helping. I mean, the Qataris, of course, have been trying to broker a hostage and ceasefire deal really for a year and a half or more now. There was brief success in November 23. There was brief success earlier this year. But one starts to wonder if the Qataris have this close relationship with Hamas and they're bringing that relationship to the negotiating table as an asset, why couldn't they use that asset to push a deal across the finish line sooner? So if that argument ever was true, I think now it's time to start abandoning that argument and coming up with new solutions. The second point I would bring up is that it's hard to um, it's hard to understand how the Qataris can serve as this sort of gathering place for different groups, different states, different countries when they're so clearly siding with one group and with one ideology over the other. And again, I'd bring up the October 7th, 2023 attack and the war that's followed as an example, because if you're following the statements that the Qataris have made, they've never condemned Hamas. They always spin events in a way that puts Israel in a negative light. Like the assassination of senior Hamas leaders, they warn against an escalation of violence after those things happen. There was a speech that was delivered, I believe it was at the UN last year, and the official who delivered it um, basically put the onus on Israel to end the violence without acknowledging that Hamas was the one that started the war in the first place. So it's hard to really believe this story or this narrative that the Qataris put out, that they're these honest brokers, they're a neutral party that's seeking to bring people together, when it's very obvious if you look at their statements that they're not honest brokers, they're not neutral, and they're siding with one group, the violent group, over the other.
And Mr. Pompeo did say that October 7 has changed everything, and it has changed, he said, the way American officials are looking at Qatar. I have a question for you, which is, would it be accurate to state that the Qatari leadership actually do agree with the goals of Hamas, maybe not the methods, but the goals? And it's also, for the listeners, it's important to make explicit what these goals are.
Right. So I can start with the second part of your question. So
Okay.
Hamas's goals, of course, are to destroy the state of Israel, to survive, to counter the West. Um, I I don't think I would be surprised if the
I think
Qataris
I'll go
came
a
out.
little bit further and say it's important also to explain why they want to destroy Israel. And of course, the reason we know, if you study the dreams, it's called the Palestinian dream. The Palestinian dream and the commitment of the Muslim Brotherhood is to revive the caliphate that was destroyed or was abolished in 1924. And my question really is, to what extent do the leadership in Qatar believe that there is ever a chance of resuscitating the caliphate?
I obviously am not inside the brains of Qatari leaders, so I can't say this for certain. But what I can say is I would be very surprised if they outwardly um, aligned themselves with those goals and with explicitly with the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. Their actions are another thing. I think if you're supporting these groups, not just Hamas, but other groups that espouse these expansionist Islamist values, you're sort of putting yourself in a position where even if it's not said out loud, it's sort of a quiet understanding that you're not opposed to those goals, even if you're not fully throwing your support behind them. I think what's really interesting in the context of October 7th and the Gaza war is that there's been a lot of talk in the last month or so about what the future of Gaza is going to look like. And I think while there's so many different plans being thrown out and different opinions, one of the things that at least the United States and Israel is aligned on is that Hamas cannot have a governing role in Gaza. Hamas needs to be stripped of its military capabilities, and it really can't exist in the way that it did on October 6th. And when the Qataris hear that, they sort of take a step back and they say, oh, well, I think the future of Gaza should be up to the Palestinian people, which on the face of it sounds right. But when you peel back what they're really saying is that we're okay if Hamas survives, if Hamas rebuilds, if Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip again, and then we return back to this cycle of violence that's been going on for many decades. And so I don't think you can really say that they're steadfastly opposed to that Muslim Brotherhood ideology that you outlined when they're at least implicitly okay with a group that espouses those values rising back to power in a strip that's really been battered and beaten by war over the last year and a half.
And Qatar, or the Qatari leadership, is not alone in radiating this ambiguous stance on Hamas. Another country is Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
To what degree are you aware of a relationship in the sense of supporting the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood between the leaders of Qatar, the government of Turkey, and the Islamist regime of Iran?
Right. So Turkey, I think I'll start there. The ruling party there has its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood. Um, Actually, what's interesting is that Egypt had a Muslim Brotherhood government for a year and a half, um, back in the early 2010s. And when that government was ousted, a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood officials were expelled from Egypt. A lot went to Turkey and Qatar. So that sort of gives you a sense of where this is heading. Um, so the Turkish government has a lot of Muslim Brotherhood ideology woven throughout it. Turkey and Qatar are both major allies of the United States, at least in name. Qatar is a major non-NATO ally, and Turkey, of course, is part of NATO. So they have that in common, this close alliance with the United States, while also um, having relationships with groups that are avowedly anti-US, anti-American. And both Qatar and Turkey have been very critical of Israel since the war in Gaza began in 2023, and have really put the onus on Israel to end the violence, to roll back their operations in Gaza without really giving at least equal condemnation to Hamas, even though Hamas arguably deserves all the condemnation for launching a horrific attack in the first place. Iran, of course, is a Shia country. The regime is Shia, so in that sense, it's a bit different than Turkey and Qatar. But the Iranian regime, of course, is extremely anti-American and anti-Western, anti-Israel, fully sides with Hamas, openly and explicitly. And so while I hesitate to put two American allies in the same bucket as Iran, and they're certainly not there yet, there is more overlap than I would certainly feel comfortable with in terms of their sympathies or understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood and of this sort of Islamist anti-Western ideology.
I think it's also under-researched, the relationship between the Islamist regime of Iran, that is indeed Shia, and the relationship that they built with the Muslim Brotherhood, or the International Muslim Brotherhood. Because as you know, they share the goals of destroying Israel and other goals. They share the goal of perhaps maybe even resuscitating some form of Islamic State and Islamizing the entire world. They share their hatred for the other governments in the region that want to go ahead and forge relationships with Israel around security and trade or economics. The Abraham Accords was so horribly frustrated after October 7. So maybe in terms of research, that is, we need more research on that.
Yeah.
I want now to move to Qatar's influence on our soil in the United States. Qatar is a top funder to American universities, American schools, and other American cultural centers. Which universities do they fund, and how much do they get?
Right. So we'd be here for well over an hour if I listed all of the universities and colleges across the country that the Qataris have funded, that have sent grants to, have sponsored uh, research for professors, have paid for tuition for students. I mean, the list goes on. There are 6 campuses, or 6 schools, I should say, that have campuses in Doha. Um, Most of them are prestigious universities: Georgetown, Cornell, Northwestern. Texas A&M also has a campus in Qatar. That campus is actually going to close by the end of this decade. Texas A&M announced that decision last year. They didn't really offer a reason. It was more so, they said, just a matter of wanting to pursue the mission of the university on American soil. Those campuses receive a lot of funding. A lot of it, of course, goes to fund the physical campuses that are in Qatar. Off the top of my head, I know that Georgetown has accepted something like $870 million from the Qataris. And that number, by the way, is just what's publicly reported to the Department of Education. There are, I'd imagine there's a lot more money that's been pumped into not only Georgetown, but into other schools that hasn't been disclosed. Because universities have had a track record for one reason or another of failing to disclose their foreign funds, not just from Qatar, but from other governments, friendly or otherwise. And also, the Qataris have a history of trying to cover up the funds that they send to universities. So Texas A&M is a big example. There was actually a lawsuit that wrapped up in Texas a year or two ago, and throughout that legal process, it something like $500 million of unreported Qatari funds was exposed. And so it's very likely that the actual sum for Georgetown and other schools is much higher than is readily apparent. And something interesting, actually, is that there's a piece of legislation going through Congress now that would tighten the foreign funding reporting requirements in order to increase transparency about the funds flowing onto American campuses, not only from Qatar, but also from China, from Russia, from North Korea. And so that's something to look out for. And maybe if that piece of legislation passes, we'll have more information coming down the pike.
There are strings attached to that money. Do you care to describe what those are?
Sure. So the money goes to various different things at various universities. Um, Northwestern, for example, its campus in Doha had a formal relationship with Al Jazeera. I believe it was Northwestern's journalism school that sent students overseas. Um, there's some schools in the country have relationships with Qatar in the sciences. Stem cell research is one thing I've seen. Autism research is another. Um, Georgetown, I've I've seen the most explicitly concerning things come out of the partnership with Georgetown. Last fall, the Georgetown Qatar campus hosted a conference entitled something like Reimagining Palestine, which, even the title alone, you can sort of get a sense of where they're going with this. And one of the panelists that was invited to speak is a former high ranking Al Jazeera executive. Again, seemingly benign on the outside, but a colleague and I did some digging, and sure enough, this guy praised October 7th as the October 7th attacks as somewhat of a monumentous occasion in sort of the history of the Palestinian cause. And there were some reports, unverified, but still they're out there, that he may have even served as a local Hamas operative in Africa in the 1990s. And so the campuses are a huge engine of soft power for the Qataris, where they're able to spread their sort of Islamist and adversarial agenda quietly. And American students then pick up these threads of thought, and if they're in Doha, they bring them back to the States. If they're in the States, they continue to spread them with their friends on campus and later on in their careers. So I think the money is a very concerning tool of soft power that the Qataris have, and we should be knowing at the very least what money they're sending to schools in America and why they're sending it.
And have there been any financial links, that's money coming in from Qatar, linked to any of the so-called protests that we saw in the spring of 2024 on campuses? And these were huge pro-Hamas protests. And the students that were taking part, there were non-students coming into the universities on campuses, but also some of the students taking part were not just shall I say, students from the Middle East or Arab students or Muslim students. Many of them were also just regular progressive students. Any linkages, any uncovered linkages in terms of who financed that incredibly well orchestrated effort?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely an area of research that I want to look into more. I haven't seen any explicit links tying Qatari funds to specific protests or specific campuses. One thing that's interesting to me is a lot of these schools that have been hotspots for protests aren't high on the list of schools that receive Qatari funding. One, for example, being Columbia. If you look at the roster of schools that have reported accepting funds, whether that's grants or contracts or gifts from the Qatari government, Columbia is very, very low down on the list, which is kind of surprising. And so I'd be interested to look further at sort of the connections between these protests or individual students and the funds that they received. I mean, I'm pretty certain there's foreign money that's funding these protests. I would not be surprised if Qatari money was sprinkled in there, either from the government itself or from affiliated organizations. Um, Actually, a lot of the money that the Qataris spend on the American education system comes through the Qatar Foundation, which I've seen branded as a private institution, but it was founded by and it's run by the royal family. So it's really government money at the end of the day that's funding these things. And so it'd be interesting to see and to just to look into what foreign groups are sending how much money to which campuses and how that's been impacting the protests that we've seen erupt.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What are they buying for?
Hmm.
What are they getting for their money? Let's move from the universities to Washington itself. In terms of lobbying, what is the clout, the Qatari clout in DC?
Right. So I've actually been tracking this issue since before October 7th, 2023. I originally started by combing through foreign agent registration forms that are submitted to the Department of Justice. There's this thing called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, and anyone who does work on behalf of a foreign government, lobbying work, PR work, that sort of thing, has to disclose that to the Department of Justice. And so I started going through the list of people and firms that have been hired by the Qataris. Um, and the Qatari money is really, really everywhere in this city. Their lobbying efforts really ramped up in 2017 when Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council um, basically cut ties with Qatar, imposed what was effectively a blockade on the country. And after that happened, the Qataris started adding all these American lobbying firms and PR firms onto their payrolls to sort of sway the administration in the Qataris' favor amidst that regional spat. And so all the top lobbying firms, I shouldn't say all, but many of the top lobbying firms have done work for the Qataris. Many think tanks in DC have accepted money from the Qataris. I think a lot of that money has sort of slowed a bit in the last few years. But it's not just in politics. The Qataris own a 5% stake in the parent company of the Washington Wizards and the Washington Capitals and sort of all the Washington sports teams. When the Capitals made a Stanley Cup run a few years ago, the Qataris paid to keep the metro open late so hockey fans could get home after the games. Um, the Qataris own a lot of real estate in this city. So they're really spreading their wealth in many different areas across DC. And that's giving them a very strong soft power presence in a city that's very important, not only in the United States, but globally.
Robert Menendez, the New Jersey Democrat, received an 11-year sentence in January for accepting bribes to benefit Qatar and Egypt. Can you give us some background to this story? And is there reason to believe he isn't the only politician getting money from Qatar?
Yeah, so I'll start with the Menendez case itself. So, as you mentioned, Menendez received an 11-year prison sentence earlier this year. And what's interesting about this case, at least to me, is that no Qataris were actually accused of any wrongdoing. Where the Qataris come in is that Menendez was working with a businessman from his home state of New Jersey who was trying to get a multi-million-dollar investment deal from a firm linked to the Qatari royal family. And where the corruption comes into play is that this businessman allegedly bribed Menendez with things like luxury watches, literal gold bars. And the expectation was that Menendez would then use his seat in the Senate to advance statements or resolutions or motions that were favorable to the Qatari government. So one example that sticks out to me is that according to the indictment, Menendez had drafted a press release or a statement or some sort of comment that praised the Qataris as, quote, moral exemplars for their role for their role helping Afghan refugees in the fallout after the U.S. withdrew. And as I mentioned earlier, the Qataris, helped broker the deal that ended with the disastrous withdrawal. And so after Menendez drafted the statement, he sent it to the businessman and told the businessman, you might want to send it to the Qataris. And then after that, Menendez received things of value. I don't remember exactly which things he received at that moment, but that's sort of an example of how the interactions happened. I also, if I'm remembering correctly, the indictment also alleges that after the investment deal was secured, the Qataris gave Menendez Formula One racing tickets. And so while no Qataris were actually accused of doing anything wrong or doing anything corrupt, they were definitely at least operating in the orbit of this scheme. And I wouldn't be surprised if they were actually involved in the bribing itself. There is, as you asked, there is reason to believe that the Qataris would do something like this. Um, they in 2022, Qatar hosted the World Cup, which they it's widely believed that they bought their way to the hosting rights. And then, of course, there's this massive corruption scheme that rocked Europe a couple years ago. It's now been dubbed Qatar Gate. And it involved the Qataris paying off members of the European Parliament to do Doha's bidding. Um, there was like a multi-day sweep of Brussels and other cities in Europe, and authorities there ended up rounding up, I want to say, at least a half a dozen European Parliament officials. It might have been a few more, a few less, and just like loads of cash in various offices and apartments. And so the Qataris really do have a history of getting what they want through bribery. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were more directly involved in the Menendez case than what initially meets the eye. And it's possible that they've done this in other places, both in and out of the US, that we just don't even know about yet.
So there might be other politicians in Congress or in the Senate that the Qataris have approached or have somehow compromised, and we don't know about it.
Yeah, it's also a possibility that they've influenced politicians throughout the government in completely legitimate ways, engaging with them on the Hill, bringing them to Qatar to see the country for themselves, um, those sort of things. I know the Qataris have um, sponsored trips for congressional leaders to Doha, and so there are legitimate ways also for the Qataris to exercise their influence in Washington that really are unproblematic on the outside. It's just that the regime that's funding them is problematic.
You've told us about Qatar's connection to the Muslim Brotherhood, their massive funding operation in the US institutions, from politics to sports clubs and, schools everywhere, actually. What do you think is their end goal? What do they want from us?
So that's really the question that I've been trying to answer in my research. I have a running tracker of all the money that I can find that can be linked to Qatar in one way or another. And that tracker is up to around $115 billion. Um, and that's only the money that I can like actually identify its dollar amount. I also have a running list of places and initiatives and different things that the Qataris have sponsored or funded or at least put their name on, for which a dollar amount isn't publicly reported. The question is, to what end are they doing all these things? I think one answer is just soft power broadly. It's good to have the United States in your good graces, and so the Qataris are able to spread their wealth to sort of strengthen that soft power muscle.
It's a lot of money for just good graces.
Exactly, which is where I think the second part comes into play. I think the amount of money that the Qataris spend um, buys them effectively immunity for doing all of the more nefarious things that they're doing with Hamas, with the Taliban, with Al Jazeera, which I should say, actually, there's a wing of Al Jazeera that's based in the United States that the Department of Justice ordered to register under this Foreign Agents Act back in 2020, and the Qataris still haven't complied. This arm, it's called AJ Plus, is still in defiance of U.S. law. So there's a lot of things that the Qataris are doing that are not in alignment with the United States, and by infusing the country with cash, they're sort of able to A, buy favor, and B, have these initiatives or these programs that are positive that they can hang their hat on, and when they come under fire or fear they're going to come under fire for supporting groups like Hamas and the Taliban, they can point to these other initiatives and effectively whitewash their reputation and say, but hey, we're sponsoring this youth basketball camp in the state of California, or look at this exhibit that we've sponsored in the Met in New York. So it's a way for them to normalize themselves despite all of the sort of adversarial things that they're involved in.
And to talk a little bit about the adversarial things that they're involved in, there is a very strong presence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States of America, totally committed to the Islamization process, or what they call offering a civilization alternative. That's how they see it. They have an entire infrastructure of mosques, Islamic societies, Islamic centers, public relations, Muslim public relations organizations, Muslim student associations. This is the infrastructure of the Muslim Brotherhood to build a presence in America and to expand. And they have an ironclad propaganda machine there where anybody who looks into it, who comments on it, who reports on it, who criticizes it, is completely smeared and made radioactive. And that is done through this instrument called Islamophobia. To what degree are the monies from Qatar spent on financing this propaganda machine and advancing this idea that there is an epidemic of hatred against Muslims in America, and we therefore must have executive orders to curb Islam, to censor the American people using Islamophobia? Can you speak to any of that?
So loosely I can, yes. So I've seen hints of Qatari money going to certain mosques and other you know, Islamic centers and things like that in the country. Nothing too substantial. I don't have a dollar amount on the top of my head. I think what's more interesting, if not concerning, is the fact that the Qataris are also involved in funding K to 12 education across the country. And it's harder to trace that money, in part because there isn't this transparency requirement in K to 12 like there is in higher education. And so we can't go to the Department of Education and, pull up a list of elementary and middle schools that have taken money from the Qatari government. What I can say is that a lot of the funding that the Qataris spend in primary schools is for Arabic programs. It's for training teachers, and so that begs the question: what is the curriculum that they're pushing for these Arabic programs? What are they telling these teachers, and how is that influencing the way very young American students are learning and how they're being brought up? So I think that's definitely an area of research that needs to be explored more. And then I think Al Jazeera, as I've mentioned, is another way that the Qataris sort of spread this ideology. Al Jazeera English is more tame than Al Jazeera Arabic, but they all fall under the same Al Jazeera Media umbrella network, and that network, of course, goes back to the Qatari royal family. And as I've mentioned, the American subsidiary that falls under this Al Jazeera Media network umbrella is flouting U.S. law in the process. And so there are a lot of concerning elements that sort of come together to create this picture of influence, anti-American influence that's sort of quietly spreading throughout the country.
Natalie, I wanted to thank you for your incredibly insightful and educational contribution to this podcast. I know you are just in the early stages of researching this topic, and not just Qatar, but radical Islam in America and across the world. I'd like to have you back sometime so we can discuss where you are at. And I really want to thank you for this. Thank you very much for your clarity.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'd love to come back when I have more in-depth research under my belt.
Thank you.